don't know if I want to do it anymore.
I don't know. And maybe she is. Did you bring food, Veronica?
No.
You're sharing. This whole row of 4 has no food. I was gonna say, I brought some food, so if you guys are hungry, let me know. What time?
Not super late, so,
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Just a little bit of a late lunch.
I do. I made my lunch before I left the office. No, I'm not sharing. Sorry. Sorry. I don't think you'd want it anyway.
No.
Big salad for salmon.
Everyone has got first child experiences. We have these kids all diapers relatable. Graphic for aces. The first thing.
When we my day, coming. But I do when I get out, it's not there.
There's only a couple people online now, and there were 12 or so that RSVP'd to be on webinar.
Okay, so many of you were here the last time we did a training that we recorded, but just a reminder for those in the room that this is being recorded and the microphones are extremely sensitive. And to those on the phone, we want to be able to communicate with you, and they can use a chat box. Is that correct?
Correct.
So as we go along with comments, questions, anything at all that you'd like us to know about how you're doing out there, all of you in Cortez, is that right? I think. Anyway.
We got 2 people on so far. One is Rebecca.
Okay. So again, acknowledging that this project, the School-Based Health Center Expert Project, is a collaboration between 3 entities and all of you, of course, and we're very appreciative for everyone involved. And an outline for the training today. It's called a learning collaborative session, and we can talk a little more as we go along about how that can be a little different than just a straightforward training. We do hope it can be somewhat interactive, and including the people on the phone. We're going to have you do a survey again, a pre and post survey in just a moment. These are the topics listed here on the screen. Some more focus on the adolescent brain and how do we interpret that when speaking to adolescents and families and other adults who might work with adolescents. Exploring risk and protective factors related to adolescent substance use, including adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. Motivations for adolescent substance use, going a little bit more in depth into that. And we really value your input because you're the experts on the front line, and so we're going to try to really engage you in what you're hearing and how you're approaching certain issues. And then a post survey. So let's start with the pre-survey. Some of you in the room may have already done this, but the same approach again, create a unique ID, and it should contain 3 letters followed by 3 numbers, but not A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. And then remember it so you can use it for your post survey. And don't put your name on either pre or post. And those of you on the phone or by webinar, you see the link there, and please chat with Kevin, who's watching the chat box, if you have any trouble accessing the survey. So I'll give you just a few minutes to do that survey. Thank you.
I'm sorry, if I'm on the phone, can you tell me where the link to the survey is?
In the chat box.
Okay, it's in the chat box.
Oh, you're on the phone.
Yeah.
Oh, I see you're not watching by webinar, is that what you're saying?
Right, I'm on the phone, so I'm curious if the link was sent to me, email, or.
What's your name? I'll send it to you in email.
Okay, my name is Marissa, M-A-R-I-S-A, my last name is Soltis, S-O-L-T-I-S. Great, thank you so much.
I can collect those surveys if you're done with them.
And to the person on the phone who is not viewing the slides, I'll try to describe the slides as we go along. If you have access to a computer, you should be able to log in and see the
Yeah, I have a copy of the slide, slides.
Okay, great. And those on the phone, if you need more time, just say, yes, we need more time in the chat box for the survey. I think everyone in the room is just about finished.
Also, for those of you participating by webinar, if you haven't already, please put your name into the chat box so I can mark you as being as attending.
I just joined, so I'm catching up.
Okay. So you can see, if you're able to see the slides, there's information about accessing the survey. And while you're doing that, those of you on the phone, I'm just going to introduce myself. I've met many of you already in the past at previous trainings. My name is Carolyn Swenson. I am a consultant working on behalf of Peer Assisted Services on this project and some other work, but I've been doing working a lot on the trainings to compile the information and deliver the trainings and learning collaborative sessions for this project. It's nice to see all of you again. Give it like just one more minute. Actually, slightly ahead of time. And we were jumping.
When it gets scrolled through, you're typing it up.
And to those of you on the phone, please do use the chat box for any questions, comments, and if we want to interact, we will unmute you. But right now you are all muted. We heard some background noise, so no offense. Okay? All right, I think we'll get going because we're right on time and that's great. So you're going to see there's kind of several miscellaneous topics in this learning collaborative, and I'll be jumping around a little. So we're going to start off again with just a reminder of the culturally and linguistically appropriate services standards that this project abides by, also known as CLAS, a requirement of this project. And there's several standards, and there are experts on these standards who you can contact for more information and technical assistance. But basically, the overarching goal and standard is that everything about the expert services that you provide is to be as effective as possible, equitable, understandable, respectful, so that that people from different cultural backgrounds, different cultural health beliefs and practices, languages, health literacy and communication needs can fully participate in SBIRT. And in the booster training, we talked a little bit about this, and I'll just highlight some key examples of how SBIRT can abide by class standards. So certainly, one example is the screening languages, and the craft that's being used, the screening tool being used for SBIRT is available in many, many languages. I don't have the exact number, but it's somewhere in the area of 60 or 70 languages that it's been translated into. Then also considering general health literacy and literacy, and one example of that would be for younger students. They may not even understand certain terms that might be asked on the craft, so it's important to make sure they know they can ask questions about what is that or what does that mean, so that you help them fill out the screening tool accurately. And then of course there's the usual vision and hearing considerations. And then for the brief intervention, one thing is that we know that brief interventions can be delivered effectively through interpreters. So if you ever do use interpreters for any of your work, that's totally acceptable in the SBIRT world. Considering developmental maturity, quite a bit about the substance use issue needs to be sensitive to cultural and community norms and issues around substance use. For example, some students from certain religions might know that their religion frowns on substance use and does not approve of it, but that does not necessarily mean they're not using substances. So approaching that in a way that's really sensitive to what culture is this young person from, and how does their family and their culture view alcohol and other substance use. Same for referrals to treatment. What will be culturally acceptable and appropriate? What's available in a community? And other challenges around accessing services for treatment of substance use disorders, including cultural sensitivity, but also transportation and other logistical concerns. So that's just a little bit on class standards. And at each topic that we're going through today, I'll pause and see if anyone has comments, questions, input about how this has already come up, maybe in your SBIRT work. And including all of you on the phone, feel free to chat. So anyone in the room have any comments about this or observations so far? Okay. Okay, so next we're moving on to the framework for understanding substance use disorders. And just a quick reminder that the way we think about substance use disorders now, as they're classified under the DSM-5, is as mild, moderate, or severe. There's three classifications. And that's dependent on how many symptoms of a substance use disorder an individual has. And that applies equally to adolescents with substance use disorders and adults. So the framework for understanding a person's risk and the manifestation and how severe a substance use disorder might be is based on multiple factors now, including genetics. I've seen estimates of anywhere from 50 or more % of a person's risk for substance use disorders is related to genetics and family history. So other biological factors that enter into the picture in terms of risk include hormones, and of course that's a critical thing as adolescents are going through puberty. Age, something we always think of, the younger someone initiates substance use, the greater their risk for developing a lifetime severe substance use disorder. The brain development that we're going to go into a bit more today. How much has a person been consuming substances? What level of tolerance might they have already built up to substance, alcohol and other substances? And then there's the psychological factors. A lot of the literature points again and again to a co-occurring mental health disorder and any other psychiatric disorder being strongly associated with a greater risk for a substance use problem. A history of trauma, and especially adverse childhood experiences and chronic stress. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. And other things that relate to our psychological state, including, again, what has a person learned, how developed is their brain, but what role models have they had, and what skills have they learned to practice resilience, to manage stress in healthy ways. How able are they to learn and understand information about substance use? And then there's behavioral factors. Very strong influence that we recognize more and more can frame or shape a person's risk for substance use disorders, especially what do they experience at home in terms of how their family members, especially parents, use alcohol or drugs to cope and manage issues. What is their social network like? Do they have a trusted adult in their life? What is the school environment like, including access to substances, peer pressure, and the general community attitudes, including access to substances. That's one of the things that we know is strongly related to a greater risk. Is the more teens have access to alcohol and drugs, the more likely they are to initiate use, and fairly quickly some will progress to more problematic use. So that's the framework that we're operating under. I think the good news about this is that it means there are many avenues to prevention. There's not one thing that determines your risk or predicts your risk. And there are many of these things, even though some can't be changed, many of these can be modified or addressed in an effective way to prevent substance use disorders. Okay, so this is a not at all detailed image of the adolescent brain, but it's going to be our framework for kind of thinking through some of the considerations around the adolescent brain. It's probably the #1 message that experts recommend that we give to teenagers and to their families and other adults who work with them about why we're especially concerned about substance use during adolescence. And so I've also been thinking about this as preparing for this session about the importance of not framing it as an abnormality, so that that teenagers don't think we're telling them there's something wrong with you because you have an adolescent brain, but rather framing it in a way that is simply focused on you're still developing. You're not fully at the point that you're going to be in another 10 years or so in terms of your brain being fully mature and at its maximum functioning capacity. And so as we're talking through this, I am very interested to hear how you might frame this for adolescents of different ages. And those on the phone, feel free to chat about this, and those in the room be thinking of messages that you already deliver to teens or ways you could frame some of this information. So I'm certainly not a neuroscientist. I'm going to glance at my notes as we talk through this, but there's well, first of all, adolescence is the last major stage of brain development up until about age 25 or 26. And the areas of the brain that are still maturing during this last great phase of development are the prefrontal cortex and the circuits, laying down all the circuits and connections within the brain. And so just a reminder about the prefrontal cortex, it is the area of the brain that is responsible for decision-making, comparative judgments, regulating actions and behaviors. So it means that even the smartest adolescents still are not quite there in terms of making always the best judgments about how much risk is something going to be to my health, or reasoning with themselves about not taking certain risks. So the other thing that's happening a lot for some adolescents is a strong drive for kind of instant gratification. And as adolescents mature, the things that reward or give pleasure become more and more complex or significant things. In other words, a younger child is fairly easily satisfied by a fairly small reward, a shiny object or praise. But as kids get older, it's normal and natural that the rewards, they want better and better rewards as sort of part of driving us toward adulthood. So that means that adolescents are quite susceptible to things that give a great reward. And examples of that would be substances like alcohol, marijuana, other substances, but also the same pattern has been noted for foods. So if teenagers, or as kids mature from childhood into teenage years, are given foods that are known to be particularly rewarding and become, develop this sort of craving for the food, especially high-fat foods, junk foods, it locks in. Their brain is actually involved in this, and they start to want more and more of that. And healthier foods that don't carry as much bang, basically, become less rewarding. So teenagers are just particularly vulnerable to seeking out really intense or potent rewards. Make sense? Okay, so that's the prefrontal cortex. Another term that's sometimes used when describing this to the general public is the smart brain, the part of our brain that makes really smart, thoughtful decisions. Adolescent is still in a process of that part of the brain maturing. The other part of brain development that's still intensely happening during adolescent into early adulthood years is that the architecture is still being laid down, all the connections within the brain. And substances can get into the picture and impede and literally derail this architecture, this circuitry that's being laid down. And there's kind of two examples of how particular substances can hijack the circuitry. So there's kind of the first major category is that some substances literally imitate the normal neurotransmitters, the brain's natural chemical messengers. And two common examples of that are marijuana and heroin. And when they enter into the picture and they rapidly get to the brain after they're ingested or smoked, the brain's fooled, literally. But these these fake neurotransmitters or imposters do not behave like normal neurotransmitters. They can literally cause harm to the brain when the brain is exposed to them. The other example of how drugs can affect the brain is that they can overstimulate. They particularly overstimulate the release of dopamine, which gives pleasurable feelings. And two examples of substances that overstimulate the reward circuit are cocaine and methamphetamine. And it's been compared to the experience of someone shouting through a megaphone into your ear rather than whispering into your ear. So our normal neurotransmitters just kind of have a very, modest effect or a level of loudness or strength. The substances, for example, cocaine and methamphetamine, are extremely intense and literally overpowering. So it makes sense that if an adolescent is exposed to these substances, they could fairly quickly be on a trajectory of becoming quite habituated to those substances. Their brain is kind of overpowered. So that's kind of the background on the brain. Before we talk about a little bit more about alcohol in the brain and marijuana in the brain, any comments here in the room or from those of you participating remotely about general messages? We're going to talk more about this later, but any initial thoughts about messages that you would provide to adolescents about their brain? How do you approach it? And how do they receive it? Yes.
One of the things that Jonathan used, you have the picture of the brain, and it highlights like the parts, especially like the prefrontal cortex that's developing. So it's like a brighter color, and then it turns like darker blue. But then underneath it, when we're working with kids, there's like a picture of a girl when she's in elementary school, and then a high school picture, and then a college picture. And so having that line up with where they are in the brain and having kids be able to see the faces and the brain and explain like it takes until like you're 25 to get there has been something that's kind of helped.
And you feel like it's,
I think it helps to explain a little bit more, because you're right, it's not like your brain is like you're a teen, your brain's just, it's teeny, it's not that, it's out of our brain, but it is growing, and so it's just showing them that growth, because otherwise you can't see it, so it's really hard.
Yeah, I like that. Any other comments in the room or anything from the chat box? No?
Nothing yet.
Okay. All right, well, we are going to come back to this in just a little preview. We did get to talk to some adolescents at the Youth Advisory Group not too long ago, and they gave us some feedback about messaging around the brain, and so I'm not going to give it away quite yet. But it was actually really interesting, I think.
Carol, we do have a question from online. It says, where can we find that infographic about the last participant just talked about?
Oh, yeah. Would you be willing to share it?
Yeah, I'll have to find it.
We'll definitely look for that, and any other, that's a great point, any other ideas any of you have or come across, we can actually search for some infographics for you, because we do know that there's been feedback over many years that some teens anyway, the science of their brain is actually of great interest to them, and yes.
Well, like, do you happen to have like a poster of this image, or?
We could, that's, yeah, I have a reference for that.
Copy this in color, laminate it, put it on the wall.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Like, that would be kind of
Sure. We have a reference for it in the notes of this PowerPoint. We'll look that up and see if we can get permission or find something similar. I think that we can definitely do that. Okay, so I also did a little bit more investigating around the two most common substances apart from nicotine that you're going to encounter, which are alcohol and marijuana, so that you can give concrete feedback to adolescents and their families and people in the schools, for example, who might communicate with teenagers. So it's well known that alcohol can cause damage in many ways to a young person's health and life. As far as the brain, the specific things that are well researched and documented about alcohol in the adolescent brain is that heavier drinking, most of these things occur when adolescents repeatedly engage in binge drinking, and that tends to be the typical pattern of drinking for adolescents. They can affect their memory. It becomes harder and harder to remember things, and of course that can obviously affect academics. It literally affects growth. It can impede normal growth. A person's brain may not end up as large as it was supposed to be if they repeatedly drink heavily. And it can interrupt those laying down of that circuitry, the connections that communicate between all parts of the brain. It can impede blood flow to the brain, and that's actually a really critical thing for normal neurodevelopment. And it can also impede brain electrical activity. So it's really very serious. Alcohol, I mean, I think with adults as well, we do not hesitate to say when we talk about alcohol with people of any age, alcohol is a toxin. And it gets very quickly to your brain. It's one of the organs it travels to very quickly after you consume alcohol. And, you know, we know these things can happen, but things that can moderate how severe might these effects be include age. Always, again, earlier substance use is considered much more serious and high risk. And remember from the booster training, for those of you who are at the booster training, for an 11-year-old, reporting even one episode of drinking in the past year already puts that 11-year-old into the high-risk category, meaning some sort of intervention needs to happen to address drinking. Family history. Because people who genetically are more predisposed to severe substance use disorders are going to be more susceptible, most likely, to the effects of alcohol. Drinking patterns. The heavier the drinking and the more frequent, the more likely the damage will occur. If it occurs with other substance use, that can mean multiple assaults on the brain. And if they have a psychiatric disorder, which is also known to affect brain functioning and brain architecture. So that's some key points about alcohol and the brain. Marijuana and the brain. Marijuana has been, especially at heavier and frequent use levels, has been associated with learning, memory, and behavior problems that are far more pronounced in adolescents. And to the point that even though there has not been a lot of research, there's conclusive research that marijuana can harm the adolescent brain, and it may take quite a long time for the brain to recover from that damage. Teenagers who use marijuana, especially weekly or more often, are known to have lower academic performance, lower motivation to meet any of the goals in their lives, and to have potentially long-term neurocognitive deficits, even lowering of their IQ, although it's not clear that that's permanent. It looks like it can be repaired over time. And then a key point for adolescents, because there's still a pretty strong belief among the general public, including adolescents, that marijuana is not really addictive, is that 1 in 6 adolescents who begin to start using marijuana will develop a cannabis use disorder. That's a true diagnosis based on the DSM-5 criteria. Adults do not have as high of a risk for developing a cannabis use disorder.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Sure.
What is the definition of a cannabis use disorder? When does it cross the line?
So it's as soon as someone has 2 or more symptoms on the DSM-5, like a symptom checklist, such as craving or not being able to keep up on your usual responsibilities. Someone can actually Google the list, but there's a checklist, and as soon as you have 2 or more of those, you've jumped into the category of a substance use disorder. And remember, each substance use disorder is based on the substance that you're talking about. So cannabis use disorder, alcohol use disorder. One more thing about alcohol that I wanted to mention. I just looked at a note here that I recorded. This is from the Centers for Disease Control, that people within the age range of 12 to 20, so underage drinking, consume about 11% of all the alcohol consumed in the United States, which I thought was a pretty significant amount of the alcohol consumed in our country. And one reason they account for so much of the alcohol consumed, or that much I should say, is because their pattern of drinking tends to be binge drinking. So they drink quite a lot when they drink. So there was a recent study published in, I believe, August of 2018 about Colorado. Some emergency department physicians at the University of Colorado at Anschutz published a paper, and I believe this has been posted to the website. We can make sure it's up there in case anyone wants to read it. But I thought that this was interesting because we're living in a context where, like the Healthy Kids Colorado survey is telling us, more or less, marijuana use does not seem to be changing among adolescents. However, so that's kind of an unresolved question. But this was a very interesting study that examined emergency department and urgent care visits with marijuana as the primary indication for the visit between 2005 and 2015, so 10 years of visits. And I know if you can see the slides, those of you on the phone, yes.
So this isn't necessarily totally related to adolescents. The largest ED issue is around edibles and young kids, not adolescent youth.
Yeah, but it is interesting that the pattern of visits has gone up, and this is Children's Hospital, ED, and that the bars that are circled in red represent those that had a behavioral health evaluation. So that when people are experiencing a marijuana-related emergency or urgent care visit, it very often, more than half the time, has a behavioral health set of symptoms or indication. So it doesn't, resolve that question about our teenagers using marijuana more, but it does, as you were just saying, potency and edibles. But the whole picture is that marijuana-related urgent issues seems to be increasing. Do you have anything else you want to add about that?
No, there's a lot of things that need to happen in the legislature around safe storage, and there's a lot of extenuating things around it. So just saying this is because of adolescent use, it's bigger than that.
Oh yeah. And I'm sorry if I gave the impression it was only referring to adolescents, but it definitely includes children of all ages, up to 21, I assume, who visited ED and urgent care settings in Colorado over 10 years. Actually, it's all children's hospital data. Okay, so that's, I think we've essentially completed the section on substance use and the brain and neurodevelopment. Any further comments about that or questions, anything in the chat box? So the next topic is adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. And I want to acknowledge right off the bat that I know many of you, including the clinics on the Western Slope, are doing a project focused on adverse childhood experiences. So this is in no way meant to be a comprehensive, in-depth section on that topic, but just another important area to consider as you're working with adolescents, and a few key points on how to approach the issue of adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. So the image on the screen right now was developed by the Centers for Disease Control to try to summarize or depict the incredibly important role for adverse childhood experiences in predicting future physical and behavioral health conditions. So the ACEs study, as it's known, has led to even more expansion of the types of screening questions that can be administered to both children, adults, and adolescents in clinical settings to identify this issue as early as possible and figure it into the type of care, the care that's being offered. So there's essentially no question now that adverse childhood experiences leads to toxic stress that has true physiological effects on the brain and other parts of the body. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the image kind of talks through the sequence of what is now known to occur if a person has more adverse childhood experiences in their history. That it, especially early in childhood and around age 0 to 5 seems to be the most critical time for the adverse childhood experiences to do their worst damage. It can disrupt normal neurodevelopment, which can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, and a greater risk for adopting high-risk behaviors, and then leading to all kinds of disease, disability, and social problems, and eventually early mortality. And adverse childhood experiences can begin to cause their damage even before someone is born. So during pregnancy, these same factors can be causing damage. So when evaluating adverse childhood experiences, they've been classified into 3 different types: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And this image primarily summarizes the original 10 adverse childhood experiences that were assessed, but now several additional experiences have been added to the assessment process. But abuse can be physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect can be physical or emotional. And the third category, household dysfunction, includes things like having an adult or another person in the household with a severe mental illness, having an incarcerated relative, a mother or stepmother who experiences violence, especially if the child witnesses the violence, substance abuse, and divorce or separation. And one that's now been also added is families who live with the threat of deportation, or a parent has been deported, is another, fairly probably common in some areas of our state where there are school-based health centers. Homelessness is another, or the threat of homelessness that's been added. So it's known that a history of adverse childhood experiences predicts a number of physical, emotional, and mental health conditions. And this slide is just summarizing what is known about adverse childhood experiences and mental health and substance use. So a person who's had 4 or more ACEs in their childhood is more than 12 times as likely to attempt suicide during their lifetime, more than 10 times as likely to use injection drugs during their lifetime, and more than 7 times as likely to to develop a severe alcohol use disorder, also known as alcoholism. And so when looking at ACEs and stress in general, and I know you all have expertise on this because you work with kids and teenagers all the time, but just a reminder that we're not talking about normal everyday stress, because there is something as known as positive stress that is, present in everyone's life and actually serves some helpful functions. It's part of growing up, but in order to be considered positive, it needs to be only mild to moderate, not severe, short-lived. It has to end. It can't go on and never end. And it leads to some temporary increases in things like your heart rate, your blood pressure goes up, more stress hormones are released, but it passes fairly quickly. And that would be the stress before, that someone might experience before an exam, a quiz, or a performance, or a game involving athletics. Then there's something known as tolerable stress. Things that are somewhat unpredictable and can be quite devastating, but they can be tolerated with certain supports and help. An example of that might be the death of a loved one or another major loss that a child might experience. It again is temporary, and if there are trusted adults in the child's life, they can help them cope, but over time, if they don't get the support and help they need, it can become toxic stress. And then toxic stress is defined as extreme, frequent, or extended, or all 3 of those. It activates a clear stress response that does not go away. It continues to exist in the child's life. And there's especially damaging if there's not the buffering of a trusted adult or a helpful adult to guide a child and provide support through these experiences. It literally can be mapped in the brain as activating the stress response. It overactivates that response and leads to long-term higher levels of cortisol. That when the cells and tissues of the body are continuously exposed to those higher levels of cortisol, it increases blood pressure, blood glucose, and can depress a person's immune response. So literally that person is not as able to fight off disease or for the body physiologically to function normally. So again, just like substances, toxic stress affects the brain. On this slide, it's depicting which parts of the brain are particularly vulnerable to toxic stress: prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And they all communicate, and this can set up an abnormal communication pattern, an activated communication pattern that results in those higher levels of cortisol that exist long term and can be creating damage in the developing child's body that can then manifest as chronic conditions later in adolescence and adulthood. Any questions or comments about the toxic stress manifestation? So that brings us then to what is known as trauma-informed care, far more involved than just what this slide is covering, but just wanted to highlight the key things now that have been identified and put into practice around providing trauma-informed care in a practice. So it's often summarized as, or framed around what's called the 3 E's, the event or events that an individual has experienced, the actual experiences that they can report around those events. How did it affect them? And then over time, what effects is that having on their mental health and physical health? So one example, very particular example of how to put trauma-informed care into practice is when communicating with individuals, adolescents or adults, is to frame our questions as what happened, what's your understanding of what you've experienced in life and how it has affected you, rather than what's wrong with you. Why is it difficult for you to, whether, manage your condition the way we've given you instructions to follow, or take a medication, or respond to things the way, we think it would be acceptable or normal, but rather help us understand what your experience has been and how that's affecting how you're approaching your health and other areas of your life. It recognizes and brings out into the open for the individual to help them understand that symptoms, quote unquote, are simply ways of coping with trauma, chronic stress, unresolved grief that they may be experiencing in their life. So it takes this very motivational, interviewing, empathetic approach to help me understand what you've gone through, how you feel it's affected you, and let's explore together how this could be related to your health, your physical health, your mental health, your substance use, and other areas of your life, how you're doing with school, for example. And those who study adverse childhood experiences and explore ways to help kids who've experienced this and adults have learned that the most effective and lasting healing comes through positive relationships, helping them find trusted relationships, including with professionals who can help them, but also nurturing positive relationships in their lives. So one of the ways that this clearly relates to the whole substance use picture is that individuals who have more adverse childhood experiences or experience any type of toxic stress are often using substances to address unmet mental health needs, symptoms that they're experiencing that have not been identified, diagnosed, or offered other forms of treatment for, to numb unpleasant emotions and memories. Substances, it turns out, they're so powerful. For some people, it's the way that they're numbing their those memories. And so it's really essential to identify the role of substance use in a person's life who has adverse childhood experiences, to help them first, understand that, and then explore together alternative approaches to managing the unpleasant memories and experiences and emotions. So any other examples from your work about how you're already approaching ACEs and toxic stress in your setting? Anyone in the chat box?
No.
Okay, so the slide that's on the screen now is the same image that's on the back of the clinician version of the craft. As a reminder to all of us, as far as what the score on the craft tells you about the severity of a substance use disorder that you may be presented with in an adolescent. At a score of 2 or higher on the craft, a 2 or higher out of a total score of 6, there's 64% or greater probability that you're looking at a substance use disorder that could be diagnosed under the DSM-5. And the craft maps well to the DSM-5, so it can actually be an aid in making a diagnosis. So when exploring adolescent substance use, another topic that we're covering today is to go a little bit more into the motivations that have been identified for why adolescents initiate and use alcohol and other drugs. The research on alcohol that's fairly extensive has identified that there's really 4 categories of motivations that emerge around alcohol use. And although it has not been studied equally for other substance use, there's good reason to think it would be similar for marijuana and other drug use. And those 4 categories are listed here: enhancement, social, conformity, and coping. And the first 2 are kind of framed as positive motivations. I do this because it is something, good, I like it. And these second 2, conformity and coping, have negative connotations. I'll explain what we mean by that. So the enhancement is simply the person who tries alcohol and likes how it feels, makes me feel better, different, and so I go back and drink it again. Social is, I like the way it increases my experience of being with other people. It makes the experience more fun, it makes me more fun, and it's all about social stuff. And these are considered kind of like positive. This is a good experience for me, that's why I go back and repeat it and drink again. Conformity is when someone feels pressured and does not have the skills to say no, does not know how to say no, or even if they do resist drinking or using drugs, it becomes an unpleasant experience. They're further pressured to conform and feel ostracized if they do not participate. Coping is quite straightforward. I find that drinking numbs my negative feelings and emotions and helps me feel like I can deal better with negative things in my life. So these motivations are really important to identify when talking with adolescents about alcohol or marijuana. And one thing about the enhancement and social aspect kind of relates to why sometimes parents feel that providing alcohol to their teen will sort of mitigate negative aspects of drinking. Thinking, well, if I provide the alcohol, it's here in our house, it's less likely that it's going to turn into something bad. But this has been actually studied pretty extensively. There was a very large and fairly lengthy study carried out in Australia that looked at parental supply of alcohol to teenagers. And they discovered that even one time of adult, providing alcohol to teenagers before around age 15 led to greater risk of binge drinking by 9th grade. And one reason for that, or the pattern that they discovered in their research, was that once adolescents were introduced to alcohol, they typically found a way to access more alcohol. So even if it was initiated in the home by parents, they then were more likely to go out and find other sources of alcohol and other opportunities to drink. So basically, I think an important message for adults who have teenagers or adults who are around teenagers is that there's not really such a thing as normal social drinking among teenagers. It can very quickly become abnormal and dangerous. So one of the best ways to identify what kind of pattern of substance use might an adolescent fall into, or which category, is to use the pros and the cons when delivering a brief intervention. And that's why fairly early in the brief intervention process, the recommendation is to ask the teenager, so what is it that you like about drinking? Or what is it that you like about marijuana? What does it do for you? And to probe a bit or prompt them if they're not forthcoming with some information, because they might not have thought about it much, but giving them the chance to think about it out loud and verbalize it can really help get to the root reasons that they may be motivated to drink or use other drugs. Followed by what are some of the downsides, because in many cases, not always, but in many cases, there are some negatives to the drinking or marijuana or other drug use. So then there's some additional considerations that can be helpful in identifying an adolescent's own patterns of substance use and helping them become more aware of reasons they may be using alcohol or drugs. So there's teen subgroup cultures, and of course it's really an unpleasant experience to not fit in. So identifying that, you know, they're affiliated with certain subgroups that typically include alcohol, tobacco, or other substance use in the culture of that subgroup. Sexual orientation and gender identity. It's well established that LGBTQ teens are more likely to initiate tobacco, alcohol, and drug use and to develop more problematic use. And sometimes it's related to that numbing of negative emotions, feeling unaccepted, ostracized, but sometimes it's very much just part of a subculture. The venues, the activities are more likely to include substance use for that group of teens. Then there's the common example of substance use to cope with mental health or behavioral health conditions that haven't been identified or diagnosed yet or managed in an effective way. Chronic medical conditions. It's well established that teens that have any chronic medical diagnosis are more likely to initiate substance use and to continue to use substances even if it interferes with the symptoms they're experiencing or the management of their condition. And this has been studied and established again and again, and some of the conditions where substance use tends to be a greater risk for kids with these conditions include diabetes, hypertension, asthma, any chronic bowel or intestinal conditions, epilepsy, obesity, and HIV infection. And for many of those, the substance use can lead to medication interactions or worse control of the condition. And then there's the community norms, peers and adult culture, and the parenting influences. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about the important role of parents. So anything else that you've observed in your work about reasons teenagers tell you they're drinking or using marijuana or other substances?
Carolyn, we have a statement from online that says, I have found that asking teens what they like about substances really opens up the conversations and insights they gain about themselves. Seems to communicate lack of judgment, and I've found often helps them to be more open to hearing negative impacts and concerns.
Anyone else having that experience? Some people in the room are nodding. Okay, thank you. So when it comes to the risk factors and reasons, and especially negative motivations for using substances, there are also some protective factors that often don't get as much attention, but they are actually well established and they're researched as things that can actually deter substance use, delay substance use, and help those kids or teens who have started to use substances. And sometimes an individual will not have all of these factors. They won't have, they won't have the benefit of having multiple protective factors, but even boosting one area of protective factors can really help with prevention and helping kids who need help changing substance use. So the protective factors are grouped into three main categories: family, school, and community. And all of them entail having supportive relationships, being given opportunities to build skills, and opportunities to contribute to their school, their community, sometimes their family. And so the more that this becomes sort of a systematic part of the care we provide, and I know that the screening assessments that you do often address protective factors to find out you have someone, an adult you can talk to that you feel like you can trust. But I just want to encourage that you are doing something that's truly an intervention when you address protective factors. And it's one of those areas that it's going to protect them against is substance use. So, and I think we're going to be continually, as we work on this project, looking for examples of how to find resources for protective services, but also what that looks like in different communities that you all are working in, so we can learn from each other about how to carry that out. Okay, let's talk a little more about the role of parents. I know you don't probably always have the chance to interact with parents, but it's emerged as probably the most important influence on teenagers, and we're working on a playbook that's going to be kind of everything and everything about SBIRT, and there's going to be a pretty robust section, I hope, on the role of parents, not only for teens that are receiving substance use treatment services, but definitely for that group of teens, but also just across the spectrum of use, even before teenagers might have initiated use. So the first key point here is that parents and the way they approach substances and use substances is a very strong influence on their children and teenagers from a very young age. So role modeling safe and healthy behaviors, being willing to talk about why does mom or dad get to drink alcohol, and explaining that it's something for adults only, but also role modeling that it's not used to cope with negative issues or problems in the family, or not leading to exacerbation of anger and violence is a really important influence on children and teens. The parenting role that's most strongly linked with being protective of teenagers and helpful and supportive to those who are receiving treatment is an authoritative but not authoritarian role. Not just saying, do this because I said so, because I'm the parent, but clear limits and expectations, but always delivered with compassion and understanding. So communication, also extremely important, not only during teenagers, but ideally starting way before that, to talk openly about substance use and substance use problems and what kids are hearing or observing in their community, on television, and other places. And being open to answering their questions. It's okay to give information. It's a really important thing that we want parents to know, that you're not going to provoke a teen or a child to try substances by giving accurate information about things like alcohol and marijuana. Monitoring of teens' activities, peers, and how they're doing with school, for example, meeting expectations that they are supposed to meet. Having clear expectations around substance use with clear consequences, and ideally talking through those ahead of time. Like, if this does happen, here's what the consequences will be, and then following through on that. Most teens who need treatment are less likely to be able to get to the treatment and access it on an ongoing basis without some role from their parents to help make that happen. And more, parents are being involved at some level in the substance use treatment services, at least with one visit, sometimes alone, and sometimes a visit with the teen as well to talk through family dynamics around substance use. So anything that you all are already doing or have observed about engaging with and involving parents, or anyone on the phone? Anyone in the room? How much do you get to engage with the parents in your work?
It varies.
It varies. Yeah.
Yeah. Some families a lot, and some families, some situations not at all. Some are completely confidential services, and others are, very much, been seeing the kids since they were little kids. So, so then very engaged with parents. I think the number one thing is that when we do the assessments, and when you ask, well, can you tell me how difficult it is? So kids who don't use, how do you make that decision, and how difficult is that? And they're like, are you kidding me? My parents would kill me. And so it's like, so then, they know that, and it's a very good protective factor for them. That's like, there's no way.
Yep, that's emerged in literature too, the research, as about the top reason, I think, worried about missing opportunities like grades or opportunities for extracurricular activities, and parents, disappointing one's parents are the two biggest motivators for most teens to avoid substances. Yeah. Anything else from anyone else in the room or on the phone? Okay, so that brings us to what I hope will be some conversation about messaging for teens. Let me just start off by reviewing what's already been addressed or identified through research, especially qualitative research and focus groups, and especially around the idea of addressing how substance use can affect the developing adolescent brain. So the folks who developed the craft did some focus groups a number of years ago in diverse primary care practices around the Boston area, but it involved a large number of teens from different types of backgrounds and ages and life experiences. And kind of two themes emerged from those focus groups. The first was that, tell us the science around substance use in our health, our bodies, our brains, and trust us to make good decisions, and tell a story or put a human face on it. And so one of the messages that's been built into the craft manual as a guide for practitioners who are going to use the craft is to just say something like straightforward, alcohol or other drug use may harm your developing brain, so I strongly encourage you not to do it. So we then, as I mentioned earlier, had the chance to meet with some Colorado teens in early February through the Youth Advisory Group organized by the State Health Department. Am I saying this right, Christina? And there were probably almost 20 teens there from different parts of the state, somewhat different ages, but mostly high school, I would say. So we asked them, what about a message from your health care team, your health professional about alcohol or drugs and how it can harm your brain? And we basically heard quite emphatically from some, it won't help at all, no way. And from others, well, it might help. So we were really left with sort of two completely opposing opinions. But one theme that absolutely came through, which won't surprise you, is whatever you tell us, if it's just, a statement, a rote statement, and carries no true personal concern for us or empathy for us as an individual, it won't make a difference. And on that there seemed to be agreement. So I thought it was kind of interesting, though, because it was somewhat different from what we heard from the Boston focus groups in terms of not necessarily being the message that would resonate with all teens. So I can tell you more about that. I have a few more notes about what we heard from the teens, but I'm curious first, what are you already doing, and how is that working, and what is your sense of messages that may apply to teens at different ages or stages of life or life experiences?
One thing I like is on the Just Health, it talks about their future plans and what they'd like to do. And so sometimes I gravitate to that to say it's really cool to see that you want to be obsessed. And that's going to take a lot of schoolwork, a lot of smarts.
Yeah.
And I just think that's great, and I want to support you in that.
Yeah.
However, and then you can, you've kind of won them over by encouraging what they're interested in, and then you can bring up how this could hurt their brain.
Right.
And the inconsistencies there.
And what kind of responses have you observed?
I've had positive responses, honestly, because you're gravitating towards what they want to do with their life.
It's a positive, it's not just like a negative message.
Yeah. And I try not to harp too hard, just go at it light.
Yeah.
And just give the science. And then pretty much, again, it's your choice.
Yeah.
And I think that's clear to give them their choice rather than be lectured at.
Yeah.
It's your choice what you choose to do.
Yeah. Other examples? How about examples? I'm just curious if any of you have used telling a story about substance use and how it affected someone.
I mean, like, you guys are recommending kind of like maybe taking a personal story that you know about someone, and obviously not being like, well, my mom, but, you know,
I didn't mean like personal, like us, like, well, when I was your age,
Right.
you know, I really wished I had done X, Y, or Z, but more like, I like to share an example of you think nothing bad's going to happen, but here's what could happen. That's what we mean by tell a story. Yeah.
I have done that.
I had an experience where a friend was calling me. They were in a different state and had experimented. And I was on the phone and they were telling me about all these different animals that were staring at them. And animals. And so I was telling the kids, like, from that side of it, like, that was something like that had happened before and it came back, and now I'm on the other side and I'm trying to support that person, but I can't be there. And just kind of talking about what that whole situation looks like and talking about how afterwards, like, we talked about that experience and what it felt like for that person and like how everything came about. So I have done that with them. That was something I just tried not too long ago, but it was interesting because it did bring it more personal. Like, there was a connection, like, oh, like, this does happen. She's experienced it. I'm not up there just like talking at them, you know, but it was something like, I don't know, it's engaging. That's it.
Can you think of any scenarios that would feel quite appropriate to bring into like a story, even if it's not literally this happened to one particular teen, but a story that might resonate with teens when talking about alcohol or drug use?
We have a comment from online. Someone said that they tried to get them to tell, they try to get the young person to tell them a story about themselves or their friends.
Okay. And their brain? Or with their friends?
Or their friends, yes.
Say how it went?
They did not say how it went.
Okay. Yeah. What do you think about that idea?
Would that be like asking them to tell you a story of like something negative that happened to their friend? Is that what you think this is?
Yeah, so, you know, you have it, you know, usually kids use with other kids. So, you know, has anything negative ever happened to any of your friends you've used?
Or family members.
Or family members, yeah.
Even in the young ones, a lot of times.
Right.
Family members.
Yep.
What are you gonna say?
Well, I think some of the stories that we might share is also very dependent on the type of student that we're talking to, and I think so much of it goes back to that personal relationship. Because I can think of, you know, a high school student I spoke with recently who is, you know, sharing that she's on the soccer team and her partner is using marijuana, and thankfully she's not, but, you know, kind of like hearing her talk about that made me think of, oh, well, I remember when I was on a team in high school and I had, you know, teammates who decided to use, and then the coach found out, and then they ended up not being able to, you know, participate in 2 weeks worth of games or practice. And so, you know, there's some repercussions in that sense, but that story isn't going to be very helpful for somebody who's not involved in an extracurricular activity. So I think so much of it is really dependent on like the personal relationship that you have with that student and what's going to be most impactful for them.
Yeah, when we were developing the first version of the marijuana clinical guideline, which we've provided in this training, and it's still considered current, one area that stood out in terms of feedback about marijuana was exploring with teenagers kind of what you were saying earlier about what are your goals and what do you think about how this could affect your goals. And in fact, one of the things that stood out was that marijuana may be treated differently than other substance use because, or especially alcohol, because at the federal level it's still illegal. So making sure they understand that even though it's legal in Colorado, there could be some consequences if you are found using marijuana as a minor that could affect future opportunities like federal loans and scholarships, joining the military were 2 examples, and just not trying to, use scare tactics so much as what do you know about how this could affect possibly some future goals that you have. Almost like it's, I feel like that's my responsibility as your health provider to let you know this, because not everyone is aware that these things could happen.
I don't think they believe any of the education you give them around drugs, because they know so-and-so's doing it, and my dad does it, and sister's doing it, and well, everybody's doing it. So I try and tell them a story about someone hallucinating and the next day he woke up and he was fine, but further down the line, he had kids and he was taking them to school, and all of a sudden this giant orange was in his rearview mirror, and he's like panicking and freaking out. And they don't believe that story either, but and then I relate it back to the brain and how it's probably not an hallucination in real life. It might be anxiety or depression or something that when you're much older.
Yeah, I guess whatever information we are sharing or whatever story, it's like, with permission, would you mind if I share a few examples of concerns, things that have actually happened to other people, but then always say, what do you think about that? So that it gives them the opportunity to say, I don't believe it, or that's, that was no big deal, or, well, he was okay, right? And it is true, we don't want to deny that a lot of people can be okay after using substances too, but there is not always a good way to predict who is going to develop the more serious problem, and that's one reason that there's kind of only one way to be absolutely sure that you're not going to be the person who's not okay, which is to not use alcohol or drugs. Any delays?
I was going to say, I think that's what I like about the previous trainings when you were talking more about the motivational interviewing and the pros and the not so good things about doing it, because then they're articulating their own stories that somebody had, kind of typed in the earlier comment. And I think that when they have to fabricate that or create that story themselves, I think they start thinking about it more. It's more personal to them, and that's really what's going to motivate that change.
Because it needs to be, so telling them that, 15 years down the road, you might not be able to get a federal job or whatever is really, to me personally, I think it's a waste of time. That's not how adolescents think, and it's really lecturing, and then they're just like done. So it needs to be in the moment, what's relevant right now for them. So yes, they have this goal of being a vet, but what's relevant right now around that? Okay, so, so school is relevant right now. So how is this affect, how could this affect you in school right now, not 5 years from now? Because their brain doesn't go 5 years from now. It goes from this moment, maybe, to 5 minutes from now. So it has to be very personal, and it has to be it's this moment right now. Otherwise, they show you out, because that's how they think. That's how their brains are developed.
Well, I think, and paired with autonomy too, is, like share some information, what you make of it, what you do with it is up to you.
Right.
And, if someone is nearing, the next step of their life, that knowing that, and they're actually thinking about, all these loans or scholarships, or have to, pass certain, criteria to get into the military or something, that it's a little more immediate than it's several years down the road. But
someone else online stated that they sometimes phrase it more in terms of these are recommendations on how to have your best possible life achieving those goals you talked about in your survey with Just Health.
Okay. Yeah. Just a little bit more in case you're interested, and we obviously have plenty of time, that we heard from the youth advisory group. Let's see. Well, first of all, and these are some quotes, so let them say it in their own words. It is not what you say, but how you say it. We hear you, but we are not listening. How to make teens listen, not just hear. A textbook does not work. Understand the individual and show empathy. Okay. Some other feedback, things that will not help us avoid substance use or change substance use. This is not exactly a quote, it's just kind of a summary. The pressures that we feel from peers and their social influence impacts the reception of that information. So if we're surrounded by a lot of people using alcohol or drugs, the information may resonate less with us than it might if we're just, not even faced with the opportunities yet to use alcohol or drugs. So again, whatever you tell us, make it really personable, or it's just we're not even going to hear it. And I know that you all get it because you work with teenagers all the time, right? Here's some examples of what we heard would help. A personal testimony about the effects of substance use would be better received than just facts. Focusing on an individual's autonomy and their individuality, that one teenager is not just like every other teenager. And not only understanding what they're using and why, but really explore their best reasons for not using alcohol or drugs, even if they're not ready to make the change yet. And so one person was very involved in athletics, and he said, that for me, it would resonate most if I started to think that actually this could affect my athletic performance. We asked also about, offering pamphlets, websites, other handouts, and there was kind of a mixed response to that, with some actually saying quite emphatically, yes, I like to collect a lot of information, offer it to me. And, they might not look at it now, but, can't hurt to have it, so don't hesitate to offer it to us. Others were, less convinced that it would be helpful to them, but some did say that even if it doesn't apply to us or we don't need the information, it's something we might share with our peers, and it could have a domino effect. We heard that. And then we asked them to give us some feedback on what kinds of alternatives would they like to hear about for different ways to handle things like stress, negative emotions, disappointments, sleep issues. And we also heard very kind of diverging opinions on that, with some saying, that sure, I'd be interested in exploring an app or some information about learning a skill like, mindfulness or meditation, yoga. Others seemed a bit dismissive. We did hear a pretty strong theme that help teens find something that they can be passionate about. That's a good thing. And one person in the group noted that he developed this passion for cooking, and it's like that's just really like helping him through life right now, is that he has this passion. And obviously that's not always easy to help someone find their passion, but having menus of options, I think, or ideas to plant little seeds can sometimes be helpful. And we did hear that, don't teach us things that are just a distraction from the negative things we might be experiencing or feeling, but something that's truly a replacement, a positive replacement for what alcohol or drugs might be doing for us now. So I guess, to me, I took away that it really does have to be individualized, but you can start with some standard approaches, but the way it's communicated can be very personalized and individualized. So it doesn't just sound like this is the lecture I give to every 15-year-old who walks through the door. Just to give you one example of a not too bad online tool for teenagers is NIDA for Teens. And this is like what the homepage looks like. And so it would be especially perhaps useful for teens where I don't know if it ever happens, but where you kind of feel like you might be veering into arguing about facts, like what's really true about a certain substance. But you could just say, well, there is a place where, researchers from around the world contribute research, and it takes a long time sometimes to get clear answers, but there are some pretty clear answers about certain substances, what they can do, how they affect a person, and offer this as one website. We've also explored some websites and apps that are things like to teach yourself mindfulness, for example, that is teen and even child friendly, and we'll be getting those into that playbook as well. Okay, so So we're actually ended quite early. Is there anything from the phone or in the room that we didn't cover that you would really like to talk about or discuss? Questions or topics they'd like to bring up?
Do you want to talk about maybe some of the handouts that are in there?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so we pulled together several things. Thank you for okay, so first of all, this article, and I'm sorry.
I know. You said mindfulness apps getting worked into something. Where were they getting worked into?
Oh, on the website. So we'll get into the playbook, but also on the CDPHE School-Based Health Center website. I'll make sure in the resources section.
Sarah, I can give you a bunch too.
Yeah, okay. So the article that's in your folder, and those on the phone will get these things emailed, right? Already did. Is written by Dr. Sharon Levy, who's a physician. She runs the Boston Children's Hospital Addiction Department, and she wrote an article called Youth and the Opioid Epidemic. And it definitely talks about the history leading up to today's epidemic, but it also has an excellent section on the adolescent brain and framing key points for parents and teens about why the adolescent brain is particularly vulnerable to substance use. I found this to be an excellent article, so we wanted you to have a copy. Thanks to, I think, my teammates, Stacy and Kevin, found some really helpful tools on ACEs and ways to frame conversations around adverse childhood experiences. So, one that just outlines adverse childhood experiences, understanding ACEs, and what do we mean by resilience? What would it look like? How do we help children and teenagers build resilience? With the brief intervention using a trauma-informed approach in this subject too. There's another resource that we will pull out and send to you or put on the website. It's an example, it's a sample of a brief intervention around substance use using a trauma-informed approach. And it's really very similar to the usual approach of a brief intervention. It just has a few examples of questions where you might connect it to experiences someone might have had in their life that were really negative or traumatic experiences. There's also several things that are available to you to listen to or watch, and we highly recommend. Dr. Nora Volkow is a really interesting woman. She's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist who's done a lot of brain imaging studies, but she's currently the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And she does a great TED Talk around addiction, and it actually relates also to suicide. So she's very engaging and interesting. That's something you could watch. It lasts probably 15 minutes or so. There's another TED Talk that many of you who are in the ACEs project might have already seen. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is a pediatrician in the Bay Area, California, and she discovered an astonishing number of, or prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in her pediatric practice, and has now become a leader on expanding the questionnaire for identifying ACEs, but also approaches that her practice has taken to becoming a trauma-informed practice. And then the Center for Youth Wellness website is another place you can go to access information and resources. And thanks to Stacy, in the room here, we'll send this to you on the phone, is this conversation guide to a trauma-informed brief intervention that kind of explains for each step of the process, how is it trauma-informed? How does it incorporate an understanding of ACEs? So, okay. Well, in some ways, I apologize that we didn't fill up a full 2 hours, but I bet no one's horribly disappointed about that. Is that an accurate guess? So we'll give you a chance to finish your post-survey and be around if you have any questions. We appreciate all of your feedback and your time to be here today and to take time out of your busy days.
And I can share one app right now because it's my new favorite app, and I think it's with every patient. One of my adult patients in private practice actually told me about it, and I completely love it, especially for teenagers. It's called Happy Not Perfect, and it is a free app when you first create your profile. A lot of times it'll have a payment system, but you can click the little X in the top right-hand corner of the screen. You don't have to pay for it. It's a completely free app. But on that app, they provide different breathing exercises, a gratitude journal, distraction, a couple of games. They have you send a little cute postcard text message to a friend to brighten their day, and then they end with another meditation. And so it's really, really great. And the very initial page has you actually click how you're feeling that day, and there are 4 pages of different emotions. And every teenager I've talked to loves it. So
yeah, we'll send it out. We'll look it up and make sure everyone has access to that information.
yeah.
Happy, not perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
About it? Before, and you the teams you know about it?
No, nobody's known about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been researching some, and I don't, that one does not sound familiar to me, so I'm looking forward to looking at it.
Yeah, I have presentation.
Oh, wow, such a great job with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.